Welcome back to the Simkins School of Human Rights. This evening, we're going to cover the middle of the 20th century and how South Carolina plays a pivotal role in the nation's and the world history in so many different ways. Now, what we were just listening to was a song that really details what happens in Ellington, South Carolina, which we're going to get into later this evening in class via Brett. But if you've been reading some of the works on the Justice Simkins School website, in particular, this excerpt from Becky Robbins' Generation Now booklet, then you'll actually get some of the context, and I'll briefly share my screen. This is again part of readings for class 12 for class this evening. And the song you just heard is really a reflection on what's going on in Ellington, South Carolina, especially with folks being forced to leave because of the arrival of a nuclear power plant in the area. And that song really reflects the troubles that folks faced in Ellington when that plant was brought to the state. But this evening, we are really honored, of course, to welcome a special guest who I'll introduce in a moment. Tonight, we have another power-packed class. We're going to talk about Southern strategy, talk about civil rights and voting rights in South Carolina, and talk a bit also about the growing protests against the Vietnam War in the 1960s, some of the other movements for social justice, social change, and for human rights going on in South Carolina and throughout the country at that time. However, to start off this evening, I'd be remiss if I didn't let folks know that you should, if you have a chance, pick up a copy of Jasper magazine, the most recent issue that's just come out. Becky Robbins has a full-page spread in the magazine, like 4 pages as a matter of fact. You should really check it out. Jasper magazine, of course, is an example of the literary arts right here in Columbia, South Carolina. And we were all really honored to have Becky be part of the magazine itself. Becky, do you want to say anything about that before we move on?
It was just it's a real thrill to be included in that. My longtime friend and a longtime member of the Progressive Network, Ed Madden, wrote this beautiful piece about the work that we've been doing, and I think it's great exposure for the school, and I'm thrilled. So thank you.
Thank you. Wow. Yeah.
Can I have something, please?
Go ahead, please.
By Becky's book.
Oh, yes, definitely.
Okay.
Yes, also make sure by Generation Know as well. I know we have an excerpt posted on the Justice School website, but check out the full book. It's very useful, it's very informative. And I think most importantly of all, what Becky has done in that book is to really bring home some of these big movements and moments in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that we don't traditionally associate with South Carolina, but we really should, all right? And on that note, I really want to get into tonight's conversation about a wide range of topics. And I actually want to begin by showing you all this particular image, right? So if you saw the email blast from yesterday, you saw this photograph of James Felder, who was a special guest this evening with Jesse Jackson. This is from October 22nd, 1973. And I think this photo is really indicative of some of the trends that we start discussing in today's class. While the Southern strategy is a major part of tonight's story, we don't want to make it seem as though everything in the South is, as the kids say, a dumpster fire. Instead, what you are seeing is that men and women like James Felder and many others were working hard to make a difference in South Carolina and across the South and across the country. Now, I also will be remiss if I didn't mention that this is actually the time period I tend to do most of my research and writing in. So for your sake and for the sake of the class, I will greatly restrain myself. But since we are talking about South Carolina, I do want to begin with these two men, Ben Tillman and James Burns. Obviously, this is a bit of a shock to go from Felder and Jackson to Burns, but you'll know why in a second. Now, when folks invoke the phrase Southern strategy, we tend to think of it as this relatively recent political phenomenon, last 50 years or so, where the Republican Party in particular, and its conservative wing especially, really works hard to cultivate white voters across the country. I've heard some historians and political scientists argue that we shouldn't call it Southern strategy, we should really call it the white people strategy. But if you're thinking about how politics in the 20th century changes, in a lot of ways, we do have to begin with Ben Tillman, who again, in the late 19th and early 20th century, really represents this conservative populist outlook that really privileges white supremacy above all else. But we don't want to forget that Tillman actually has a massive influence on politicians in this state, including, of course, Jimmy Burns. Now, Jimmy Burns is one of those figures in the history of our state and the country who it's hard to say if he's gotten his due for just how much damage he's done to American history. But Burns is actually a really important figure when you think about what I would like to call a long Southern strategy. This idea that the Southern strategy doesn't simply begin and end with Richard Nixon or Barry Goldwater. Instead, it has a much longer lineage, and it actually involves a lot of folks from South Carolina. Now, I actually want to take our story back a bit to 1948, which we talked about in class a couple of weeks ago. Now, if you look at this particular map, right, the blue is for Harry Truman, the red is for Thomas Dewey, the Republican candidate, but the goldish color is for Strom Thurmond, who ran in 48 as a states' rights Democrat or a Dixiecrat. Now, you notice, of course, South Carolina goes for Thurmond as the hometown hero, along with Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. But I want to point this map out because behind the scenes, within the Democratic Party, you're already starting to see fissures and fractures over civil rights, over a variety of progressive causes and issues. For example, in 48, you also have Henry Wallace running as the Progressive Party candidate. He actually gets almost as many votes as Thurmond, but his votes spread out all over the country. But folks like Jimmy Burns in the Democratic Party are really asking some serious questions about where the party's going, in particular on the issue of race and civil rights. And this is actually where I want to bring into play Dwight Eisenhower. Now, Eisenhower, we think of him as a president who was a moderate Republican, who won 2 terms in the 1950s. During his administration, the Brown v. Board decision was rendered, Emmett Till was murdered, and the Montgomery bus boycott occurred. Amongst historians, Eisenhower has, at best, a mixed legacy on civil rights. He wasn't really a staunch civil rights advocate. However, he also felt as president, he had to uphold the Supreme Court decision Brown v. Board, however reluctantly. He was actually begging the Supreme Court behind the scenes to not render the decision they end up rendering. In fact, he talks about his decision to appoint Earl Warren to the court as what he called later on, quote, the biggest damn fool decision I've made in my life. But if you look at this image, this is actually from Georgia State's digital library collections. This is Eisenhower meeting with James Burns late in the 1952 campaign. And this photograph is actually fairly significant because while we start the Southern strategy in the 60s, in the 50s, you're already seeing a lot of Southern Democrats asking the question, which political party is actually our home? There was a lot of uncertainty that it was the Democratic Party, and you're starting to see more overtures from Southern Republicans, these white Southern Republicans, or Democrats, to the Republican Party. And this is an example of that. This is Eisenhower being greeted by James Burns in 1952 around that same time, this is the same trip, in fact, Eisenhower actually gives a speech in Columbia. And I want to show you an image of this right away. This is a speech for South Carolinians for Eisenhower. And you see here, the date is September 30th, 1952. I think we all recognize the State House grounds behind Eisenhower here. But the Southern Democrats in South Carolina, they were openly aligned with Republican candidate in Eisenhower. And in fact, Eisenhower comes very close to winning South Carolina in 1952. He does win several upper South states like Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia. And you're starting to see already some of these cracks coming into play within the Democratic Party. Now, the thing about the electoral map, though, and again, I want to go back to Eisenhower and this long Southern strategy idea. This is Eisenhower in South Carolina about 10 years later in 1962. But you are seeing Republicans, especially in the conservative wing of the party, really asking some serious questions about, or Southern Democrats rather, about which party they should be in. Now, one group that already noted how conservative white Southerners really were and how their alliance with New Deal Democrats couldn't last forever were, of course, Black Americans. For example, Martin Luther King Jr. in the 1960s, in his last book, Where Do We Go From Here, he actually writes extensively of the alliance in Congress between, on the one hand, Dixiecrats from the South, and on the other hand, right-wing Republicans from the North and the Midwest. So many civil rights activists, many Black nationalists, many progressives noted this alliance in Congress and how it stymied a wide range of attempts at progressive legislation, whether it was civil rights, universal health insurance, so forth. Arguably, the most pivotal figure in 20th century political history is this gentleman, Harry Dent, who was from South Carolina, St. Matthews, and he actually works for, amongst others, Strom Thurmond. Dent is really the primary mover and shaker in pushing Thurmond to lead the Democratic Party and join the Republican Party in 1964. But also Dent is working with other Southern conservatives to really think about how to push the Southern states from the Democratic and Republican Party's column in presidential, congressional, and local elections, and B, how to do this without appearing too racist. Now, this is the really important part here of Southern strategy. Southern strategy, as Dent and others really conceptualized it in the 60s and 70s, really accepts at face value some of the gains of the civil rights movement. Again, I emphasize face value, because they're also using a lot of language and political tactics and strategies to undermine the gains of that and other progressive movements, while at the same time trying to make appeals to not only conservative, but also many white moderate voters. I'll give you an example. In the early 1960s, Republicans like Barry Goldwater are also talking about how do we target the South. And there's a quote from Goldwater in 1961 where he says that we ought to, quote, so we ought to be hunting where the ducks are, end quote. In other words, saying that civil rights has proven that Black American voters are more than likely going to go to the Democratic Party. Again, in history, context is always king. He says this in 1961. The previous year, John F. Kennedy narrowly defeats Richard Nixon, and many agree the chief reason he wins is because of the Black vote in the North and the Midwest, and what we now call battleground states. Jackie Robinson, the famed baseball player and activist and Republican, urged Nixon to do more to appeal to Black voters in 1960. He didn't do so. Kennedy did, and Kennedy ends up winning the election. For Goldwater and other conservatives in the Republican Party, the lesson they took from this was we should start targeting white Southern voters. Now in 1964, well, you can see the map. Kind of doesn't work then. In the short term, the gains seem pretty limited. Goldwater only wins 5 deep South states, as you can see. South Carolina proudly cast its electoral votes for Goldwater, and Goldwater's home state of Arizona. In the aftermath of this election, in fact, there are numerous editorials from the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Newsweek, and the Nation, all declaring that conservatism as an ideology is dead and buried. This election, just a year after Kennedy's assassination, and using the triumph of the Civil Rights Act in summer of that year, for many it seemed that liberalism was on the rise, that the nation was a liberal nation, and that conservatism had no place to go. Well, that's not exactly what happened. And part of why that's not the case is that the Southern strategy is perfected. They go back to the drawing board. Harry Dent and others work with Richard Nixon to really construct a better idea for this Southern strategy, so that by 1980, the map looks like this instead, where it's mostly red. Ronald Reagan wins in the landslide. I'm showing these maps to give you some context, politically speaking, for what we're going to be talking about this week and next week as well. But with the Southern strategy, one of the things I want to point out is not only Harry Dent's importance to it, but how in the 60s, everyone was already talking about this strategy as a real thing. I want to bring this up now because there are some Republicans today who will deny that there was ever such a thing as a Southern strategy. Instead, I want to show you this story from the New York Times that was published on Sunday, August 18th, 1968. And I'll zoom in here. It says, alienating the Negro vote. The first paragraph is where I got the Goldwater quote from. It says, in the fall of 1961, Barry Goldwater said the Republican Party, we're not going to get the Negro vote as a bloc in 1964 or 1968, so we ought to go hunting where the ducks are. And this article in the New York Times talks about how the Republican Party was really shifting towards a Southern strategy that they felt could not only get white Southern voters, but, and this is very important, but also get white moderates across the country. And again, if you look at this article here, you see here it says, granted that what flopped in the political situation of 4 years ago, 1964, may not necessarily fail in a different situation today. Richard Nixon's strategy for 1968 seems to most Negroes to rest on the same general concept as Goldwater's in 1964. In their view, he is appealing to the white backlash and writing off the Negro vote. To the Negro, 3 of the more obvious Nixon appeals to the backlash have been the frequent outcries for law and order, his reticence, his reliance on the support of Southern segregationists like Senator Strom Thurmond, and the naming of Governor Spiro Agnew of Maryland as his running mate. So you already see how the idea of a Southern strategy is out there in the public sphere. People are talking about it in 64 and especially 1968. And after Nixon wins in 68, this Southern strategy idea really takes off for the conservative wing of the Republican Party. Now, one misnomer about the Southern strategy is that I think historians, when we talk about it in public, we tend to treat it as though it's Southern strategy goes into place and everything happens overnight. No, it takes a multi-generation process. Now, I want to answer Kim's question in the chat very quickly. She asked, I must be missing something. I'm weak in this area, my apologies. Did not Eisenhower put out a Civil Rights Act in the 50s? Not defending, just confused about it. Actually, in 1957, there is a Civil Rights Act passed, primarily thanks to Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson. I Eisenhower reluctantly supports it. It's a very watered down Civil Rights Act. There's a reason why protests continue after 1957. But Eisenhower's support of civil rights was very much contingent on the idea that while he personally was on the fence about civil rights, in fact, you can make an argument that he wasn't really pro civil rights at all. The point Eisenhower was making was that if the federal government, like the Supreme Court, passes or decides Brown v. Board, and if Southern states are going to not enforce the law, or in fact try to actively violate the law, then he has to follow through in his work as Commander-in-Chief, that's leader of the executive branch of the government. This is why he sends the 101st Airborne, Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957, because of what's happening at Central High School. But again, Eisenhower, beyond that in the 57 Civil Rights Act, he's not a stalwart proponent of civil rights. In fact, one of the great historical ironies is that his vice president, Richard Nixon, might have been better on civil rights than Eisenhower was, or at least more forward-thinking in the 50s. By the 60s, he changes his tune when he realizes there are, again, votes to be won where the ducks are. Now, this Southern strategy idea, again, as we've already discussed, it has a lot to do with what's going on in South Carolina. And again, Harry Dent working for Strom Thurmond decided to make the party switch in '64 to support Barry Goldwater and the Republican Party. This is a watershed moment in Southern politics and really displaying what the Southern strategy is. And by '68, you're starting to see this come to fruition in some form or fashion. But like I said before, this isn't all overnight. Now, one thing I have to also talk about for just a second is that while the Southern strategy is being perfected and revised by Republicans, Democrats in the South are also beginning to realize that on a state and local level, they too are going to have to win Black voters, which is something that Mr. Felder will talk more about in just a moment. You have the rise of what's called New South Democrats. Mostly white men like Jimmy Carter here, governor of Georgia in the early 1970s, or right here in South Carolina, John C. West, who was governor around the same time. These are Democrats who are really defined by really three things. Number one, they accept the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts. They say that civil rights movement was a good thing for the South. It happened, let's accept it and move on, number one. Number two, they are very moderate on most social issues. For example, Governor Carter here, before he runs for president in 1976, he is best known to many in the Democratic Party as trying to stop the nomination of George McGovern in 1972. He's actually one of his most stalwart critics in the '72 campaign, and Carter and other Southern Democrats are really committed to a moderate vision of the party, which brings me to point number three. New South Democrats were also staunchly pro-business. They were not outwardly hostile to the New Deal or the Great Society, but they weren't exactly its champions either. And amongst Democrats like Jimmy Carter, for example, when they come into power at the national level, late 1970s, you're really going to see this come into play with things like deregulation and the like. But the thing about Governor Carter here or Governor West in South Carolina is that by the early 1970s, even with the Southern strategy going on across the South and really throughout the nation, it's not clear that it's going to pay dividends all the time. Now, I mentioned before that Harry Dent had worked for Strom Thurmond and later on works for President Richard Nixon. In fact, one of the readings on the Modjeska School website is a memo that Dent writes to Nixon about the Southern strategy. We may come back to that later in class. But by 1970, Strom Thurmond is also trying to find ways to really to harness the Southern strategy power and use it on a state level in South Carolina. Now, Albert Watson becomes the Republican nominee for governor in 1970, runs a very conservative, some would say reactionary campaign running on the Southern strategy model and really using that as a template for his campaign. Now, in 1970, there is still a significant amount of backlash to civil rights in South Carolina. That year, for example, we have a Lamar bus ride where white parents in Lamar, South Carolina are so incensed by the use of busing, taking kids from one part of the community to another to really enforce segregation, that they actually overturn a school bus. It becomes national news, and it really shows how busing as an issue is deeply unpopular all across the country. This is also 2 years after the Orangeburg massacre we just discussed on yesterday's Sunday school session. That context cannot be forgotten because, again, the cry of law and order that becomes a hallmark of Southern strategy was also a chief reason why the police reacted the way they did in Orangeburg in 1968. And so in South Carolina, on the surface, it appears there is a considerable appetite for someone like Watson to become the next governor of South Carolina, promising to somehow, some way, roll back the gains of the civil rights era. Instead, he is beaten by John C. West, a moderate Democrat who really promises to take the state into a post-civil rights, some may even say a post-racial era that, as we all know, has worked out so well over the last 50 years.
Yes.
But this Southern strategy, it doesn't quite work. And Watson's defeat actually has a major effect on Thurman. After 1970, Strom Thurmond also, he can read the tea leaves as well. And he starts to become much more moderate on the issue of race and racism. In fact, he becomes, for example, one of the Senate champions for making Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday a national holiday in 1983, something which no one could have imagined in 1968 when Thurman basically said that King had it coming. Another thing I want to really highlight very quickly with Southern strategy, and I'll turn the floor over to Mr. Felder here, is that a lot of politicians in the Deep South are having a difficult time trying to come to terms with this new era of civil rights. And so well, this be kind of fun. I want to just show an issue of Ebony magazine from August 1971. This is one of my favorite primary sources ever. It's called The South Today. All right, so this is a reflection on Black life in the South in the post-civil rights ongoing Black Power era. But my favorite section of the magazine, besides the advertisements, is this. This is actually a really interesting section. It's called White Voices of the South, where Ebony magazine actually interviewed several white politicians in the Deep South to ask them, well, how are you adjusting to a post-civil rights and, more importantly, a post-voting rights act American South? And you see one of the folks they interview is John C. West. Let's see what South Carolina's governor had to say. And I'll zoom in here. He said, "It is my feeling that arguing about race, making it a political issue, really is a waste of time and energy. We have little progress as a result. Getting involved in that sort of thing simply saps the emotions, the energy, the real thrust of the human spirit, and the spirit of government. I am vitally concerned about the unemployed and the underemployed Blacks in South Carolina. My experience tells me that the biggest single thing we can do to uplift this state is to provide every single individual the opportunity for better jobs, better housing, everything that will improve the quality of life." And again, what you see here is really West offering this new South Democratic vision of, again, looking beyond race, saying that racism is a thing of the past, we have to move on from it. That's the best way to go up against it. But my favorite entry is actually from George Wallace. Now, again, this is George Wallace in Ebony magazine. His interview response is actually this. I have always felt that the people in the South could be cited as an example to the rest of our country, because there is a lot of genuine good feeling between blacks and whites down here. There always has been. Even though we have sometimes been misinterpreted and misunderstood by many who do not really know us, we know that Black people have always had something in the South that they did not have in other sections of the country, concern from whites. Putting aside the jokes here of George Wallace saying, we always got along after all, this also reflects how Southern politics have profoundly changed. I mean, again, Wallace and Strom Thurmond, who's also here in Ebony Magazine, they're all having to talk about race in a way they didn't do even 10 years before this. Thurmond, he says here, recently a friend and supporter of mine in South Carolina related the following story to me. A Black person, when asked to support me for re-election to the US Senate, replied, quote, let me think about it. Senator Thurmond has never stabbed us in the back. He might stab us in the front, but never in the back. My reaction to the story was one of mixed emotions. I was naturally pleased that someone thought me innocent of the charge of being two-faced, a charge often made against those holding political office. Yet it was quite disturbing to realize that perhaps this man spoke for other Black citizens in South Carolina, and that many of my constituents might view me as strongly opposed to their interests. The truth is that I believe in promoting the best interests of all of our citizens, both Black and white. And in most instances, I am confident that we have more in common as Southerners than we have reason to oppose each other because of race. Now, again, Thurmond says this less than a year after Albert Watson's defeat. And this really shows how Thurmond, he's many things, but he's not stupid. He understands that in South Carolina, he's gonna have to at least mollify the Black vote. At the very least, not make sure they are activated and really energized and defeat him. So you start seeing him tell anecdotes like this. But again, Thurmond and Wallace and others are all saying, Black and white folk, we always got along. That civil rights thing was just a misunderstanding. All right, so on that note, what I want to do now is, let me answer Randall's question real quick in the chat. He asked, isn't the current consensus by researchers that busing worked to raise African-American school progress vis-a-vis white students as unpopular as it was with white students? All right, parents, that is kind of true, Randall. There is some research that shows this, but when it comes to busing, what is also very clear is that it was incredibly unpopular amongst both white and Black citizens. Many Black Americans in particular felt that busing was but just emblematic of the fact that desegregation had gone so far as to really destroy many Black schools and ruin the lives and careers of many Black educators and administrators alike. Something that we can make an argument we've never really fully recovered from. Yes, brother.
I want to bring up a couple things. Are you through with stuff,
Yes.
I want to go back and lift up a couple things. And one is Tillman in 1909 sponsored the Tillman Act. Who knows what the Tillman Act is? Robert, keep your hand down. 1909, Roosevelt, Teddy, had been caught with taking a whole bunch of money from rich people, which was not an unusual thing to do in politics. Tillman sponsored and it passed and it stood until just recently a prohibition on federal candidates from taking corporate donations or donations from national banks. And it was only with the Citizens United ruling in 2012, thereabouts, that the leadership decided, well, we better take the money now.
Yeah.
And so Tillman evidenced that he called himself a populist. And he did the reason the big building at Clemson is named after him is he worked real hard to get the land grant colleges for both Black and white people. And so he was a racist segregationist who was a master politician, and he passed his skills on to Jimmy Burns. Jimmy Burns is one of the few people, if not the only one, every time I see this written, they always qualify it. Maybe he's not the only one, who served in every position you could have in a state legislature and in the federal legislature.
Pretty much, yeah.
And Jimmy went to Washington, but he was a mentee of Tillman's. Tillman was older than him by a considerable amount. Tillman died in 1909. Yeah, and so Burns, I guess he really comes back on the radar screen in let's see, Burns 51. He comes back to South Carolina, but before he comes back to South Carolina is where he really makes his name. And he was appointed by Roosevelt to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
one of the reasons America knows Brown versus Board instead of Prince v. Elliott.
Taking my thunder.
Uh-oh. You'll have to stay tuned to find out why. He knows that. But Burns moved right on up after Roosevelt died. Well, before Roosevelt died, the war's going on. Roosevelt brings Burns on to manage the war budget. And part of that's a lot of money. And part of the war budget is the Manhattan Project.
Yeah.
So Burns is in all this stuff. And so one of the things that you will read if you read the book that is Generation No, which is K, large N-O-W. There's a lengthy piece in there about the Savannah River plant. But I want to talk just a little bit about why the Savannah River plant's here. And next lesson, we're going to hear things that happened in the 70s and 80s about the bomb plant. But Jimmy Burns
Okay.
was Truman's Secretary of State. Jimmy Burns was in Yalta with Truman when the war was ending. Jimmy Burns could have been Roosevelt's vice presidential choice and would have been president of the United States when Roosevelt died, had it not been for Burns's need to be a staunch segregationist to keep his power in South Carolina. Or maybe Burns was just a so-called racist and couldn't turn loose of it. But that Burns as the Secretary of State ends up being at the table, also holding the money reins for the Manhattan Project, being very involved in the development of the nuclear bomb.
Yeah.
And I found a memo at the Atomic Museum that is quoted in Becky's book about Burns being on the interim committee that Truman created, secret interim committee that had the scientists from the Manhattan Project, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and some politicians. And reading history that I've been able to sort through and believe, Burns was the only one in the room that was arguing to go ahead and drop the bomb. And there's a direct quote from a memo that I have read that attributes the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima on a military facility surrounded by civilian population with no warning. And so that he won the argument because there was a strong argument against not actually dropping it on a population. The Pickett Island making it vaporize. And so the arguments that you will hear, and one of the links in, I think it was the link that went out either in this lesson plan, is a link about the Savannah River plant. There's a quote in there from Truman about dropping the bomb to end the war. Well, there are a lot of people that believe that we didn't drop the bomb to end the war. Burns dropped the bomb because he saw the bomb as the panacea of diplomatic control of the world to get in front of Russia. And that Burns, being the staunch segregationist he was, smoothly moved into using communism with anybody that was against segregation. And so we saw that big shift of that Southern strategy moving towards using communists as people that were un-American. And there was I think one of the greatest tropes in the world was that all these people that wanted to stop segregation and the things that were along with it must be favoring the Soviet Union. And so those types of manipulation of reality were lifted up by everybody from the president right on down to the media about dropping the bomb. And so Burns passed the torch to his mentee, Harry Dent. And Dent worked with Burns, Dent worked with all the presidents. He worked with I lost my presidential flow there, but Dent worked with everybody up to Herbert, Papa Bush,
Yeah.
H.W. Bush. And that along the way, here comes with Ronald Reagan in 1984, 80, and in 80 was this young guy who was Dent's mentee, also from Columbia, named Lee Atwater, who I drank beer with. And that Lee was somebody that I think is really scary, but I see him a lot in people today. I don't think Lee didn't have some kind of visceral hatred for Black people. I've been around him with Black people. He played with B.B. King and all these other people. He was a political snake, and he really enjoyed the game. And we've got a lot of people like that now that will use whatever they can use to be able to advance their cause, and they're amoral. But Atwater worked with this guy named Paul Manafort and Roger Stone, and when he left, and he was with Reagan from 80 to 88. Reagan served 2 terms, but in 84 he hooked up with these groups here, running a lobbying firm in Washington that was so cold-blooded they were referred to as the torturers' lobby, and their clients were dictators around the world. And so Atwater was just a big fit for them. And so this is Atwater is no longer with us, but he probably would have been right in there, probably manipulating Trump, even be more dangerous than he is, or find another person. But you do notice that Paul Manafort actually was convicted.
Yes.
And Roger Stone got convicted.
Yes.
And he got but this hand of South Carolina's dirty tricks has been very well hidden, but very effective and doing bad things. So I think that's what I have to add. Jim, you might have something to say about
Yeah, so I wanted to, on that cheerful note, I wanted to introduce Mr. James Felder, who was for many years a civil rights activist. He was an integral part of the voter education project in South Carolina in the 1960s, which, as we'll discuss in a moment, makes a big difference on a statewide level in the late 60s and early 1970s. Of course, later worked with Jesse Jackson, Operation Push in Chicago. And I want to just show this image very quickly. He was one of the first 3 Black legislators in South Carolina in the post-Reconstruction period in 1970, right? And you see the 3 men here, I.S. Lee Johnson, James Felder in the middle, and Herbert Fielding, right? And again, we've talked a lot about Reconstruction, and in the 1970s, you begin to see a lot of first since Reconstruction X, Y, and Z all across the South concerning the return of Black politicians to state legislatures across the Deep South. And these were the first 3 Black legislators in the state since the late 19th century.
Brett. Cold in here.
Cold. Jim's gonna warm it up someday.
All right, so on that note, I want to introduce Mr. James Felder. We are honored to have him here this evening. It's not very often you get to hear about history from the folks who actually made it. Ladies and gentlemen, a warm round of applause for James Felder.
Thank you, Dr. Green, and hello, everybody. Let me pick up on Jimmy Burns for a minute. Jimmy Burns came back home to South Carolina in 1950 after all of his Washington antics and ran for governor and became governor. At the time, the Briggs versus Elliott lawsuit had surfaced, and he wanted to thwart that effort. So he was the one that put on the sales tax in South Carolina, a 3-cent sales tax that went into effect in 1951 to build new schools for Blacks throughout South Carolina and renovate other old schools. He thought that would help to slow down the Briggs case that's moving up to the Supreme Court. Well, it didn't. And Briggs became Brown versus the Board of Education. Now, I have a problem with the Brown versus the Board of Education. name,
Mhm.
not the lawsuit, but the name. It should have been Briggs versus Elliott.
All right.
It was the first suit to get to the Supreme Court. And when there are a series of cases from the same petition, they list them in alphabetical order. And BRIG goes before BRWN, right? So it should have been Briggs versus Elliott. But Jimmy Burns didn't want South Carolina to be on the top of that situation. So he literally lobbied Supreme Court members. Earl Warren was Chief Justice, and he came aboard. Eisenhower appointed him, and just as you said, Dr. Green, Eisenhower said it was the damnedest decision I ever made by appointing Warren to be Chief Justice. But Warren wanted a united decision from all of the courts, so he went along with Burns' suggestion of putting Brown on top. The other thing was Thurgood Marshall, never argued Brown case. Thurgood argued Briggs versus Elliott from Clarendon County to the Supreme Court. It was Robert Carter, Jack Greenberg that went out to Kansas and handled the Brown case. Thurgood never set foot in Kansas, but all the cases were put together and lumped and heard on the same day. But it was Thurgood who argued Briggs. And as of right now, Cecil Williams and myself and a law firm out of Camden have prepared a brief to the Supreme Court asking them to change the name from Brown versus the board to Briggs versus Elliott. You'll hear more about that. That's what I said. All right, that's Jimmy Burns. Now, to talk about presidents, you know, they said Franklin Roosevelt proved the man could be president as long as he wanted to be. He was elected 4 times, died in office. They said Truman, with his drinking and playing cards with us over in the Senate and poker, and his smoking and cussing, proved that anybody could be president. Then here comes Eisenhower. Eisenhower spent more time on the golf course and in the hospital than he stayed in the White House. So the thinking was that maybe we don't need a president after all. But anyway, the other thing with Eisenhower was, and you covered it very well, was the fact that he opposed the integration of the military. Eisenhower did. But strong, I'm sure I'm on my mind too. But Truman, after the case in Batesburg, Leesville, where the Black veteran was blinded, Isaac Woodard, the NAACP head, Walter White, went to Truman and said, we got to do something about it. And that's when Truman issued an executive order desegregating the military in 1948. And Eisenhower was opposed to that. I just want to get that off my chest, but after the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, a group of foundations put together a pool of money and send it to Atlanta, to the Southern Regional Council, which was a Southern human rights organization based in Atlanta, chaired by a man from Sumter named, you look at me, from Sumter. He was a Presbyterian, he taught school at Coker College, had a huge farm over in Sumter. Dabbs.
Eugene.
Not that Dabbs. The one that they call was a communist. James McBride Dabbs.
Rogers, he spoke at the event that we put on in '69 at the university.
Oh, that's correct.
Mayfield.
He was chairman of the Southern Regional Council. So with that money, they hired a young man named Vernon Jordan. And Vernon's task was to find a director of voter registration in each of the Southern states. I was in my last year at law school in DC. And he came up to Washington. Ms. Simkins and Ida Cranston Newman, Lincoln Jenkins, Matthew Perry sent them to bring me home. They needed somebody to come home and do voter registration. I accepted the job with some hesitation because I'd been gone for 10 years. I didn't know what South Carolina was like in 1967. I left in 57 to go away to college. So I went over to see Ernest Hollins, who was just elected to serve out the term of Johnson, who had died in office, and asked him, what was it like in South Carolina now? I hadn't been back there in 10 years. And he said, well, boy, you ought to go on back home and get your people ready to vote. Well, he had selfish reasons. He was up for re-election and he needed all the votes he could get. I came back home to do voter registration. In an 18-month period, we were able to register over 200,000 Black voters in South Carolina. When I got here in 67, there were only 50,000 Black registered voters in the entire state and 8 Black elected officials. 4 of them were in Eastover, and the other 4 were down in Beaufort County. Today, we have 928 Black elected officials and 1,002,000 Black registered voters, roughly 33%, a third of the registered voters. And that's a whole nother story. We could determine any statewide election in South Carolina if we could only raise the turnout. But you can't do it if you're only voting 52, 53, 54%. So we got to do better there. But anyway, we put on that drive, got people registered, and made a difference. Old Strom Thurmond saw something in that. We got 100,000 Blacks registered to vote, and all of a sudden, Strom Thurmond, who said he couldn't say Negro, he would say the Negroes. He learned how to say Negro after 100,000 registered Black voters. We got 150,000 registered. Old Strom sent out letters, my dear Black constituents, and after he started Street, we're sorry. We got 200,000 registered, and Strom Thurmond was the first of any Southern congressperson to hire a Black staffer, and that was Tom Moss from Orangeburg. Tom stayed with Strom for 30 years, and if you wanted something done, you called Tom Moss, or you called Strom, and Strom would call Tom Moss and make it happen. 2 instances where it really came into play. One was with Allen University. This is 1974. Allen was having serious problems, about to go out of business, owed internal revenue over $500,000. Staff hadn't been paid in 2 or 3 months. B.J. Glover was the president at the time. B.J. called Strom Thurmond. Strom Thurmond sent Tom Moss over to meet with Dr. Glover. And that $500,000 internal revenue problem just disappeared. Allen honored Strom with an honorary doctorate degree.
Okay.
Morris College over in Sumter, same thing, 1974. Morris had dwindled down to 200 students, half the buildings were boarded up, owed internal revenue, 300,000, owed local creditors, another 400,000. Lawrence Richardson went over to take over Morris College. He was passed over at Benedict for the presidency, and so he accepted the job at Morris College. He knew what Strom had done for Allen, so he called. Phone call from Strom Thurmond. Internal revenue problem went away. He cut a deal with the local businesses and said, listen, we can't pay you all we owe you. But if you will donate half of what you owe us and work out a payment plan on the other half, all will be well. Well, they did that. And in a matter of 4 years, Morris College was out of debt, part of the United Negro College Fund, and also a part of the Southern Association of Colleges. Now, we got all these folk registered to vote. Some of us have been trying to run for office before 1965, Modjeska Simkins, MP Pride, and several others here as well, but could not get elected. Why? First, we didn't have enough Black voters to do it, but the reason was the full slate law. Full slate law was a law that stated if there were 10 candidates running for office or 10 seats available, you had to cast your vote for 10 people. If there were 2 blacks running and you only wanted to run for those 2, wanted to vote for those 2 blacks, you still had to vote for 8 white people that you didn't know in order to have your vote count. Because if you didn't do it, your vote was not counted. So that had been going on. Well, we said, and it began with Jim Clyburn, he said, we need to start another party, another political party, as we had happened back in 1944 with Progressive Democrat. We need to start our own party. Well, to do that, you needed 10,000 signatures on a petition. Jim Clyburn, Ike Williams, John Harper, Alan Alston, Ed Day, Bill Saunders out of Charleston, myself, Jim Solomon. We got together and started getting petitions signed. We contact IP Standback. He was the, what you call it, the most worshipful master of the Prince Hall Masons. And you had Masons all over South Carolina. Asked him to get into this game of helping us get signatures. And we were able to get 10,000 signatures to start the United Citizens Party. Well, it woke up Democratic leadership. All of a sudden, Don Fowler and some others said, well, listen, you all don't have to do that. We'll support you. We'll work with you, but just give us a chance. Give us a chance. Well,
300 years wasn't enough.
give us a chance. So what happened was in the 1970 election, 4 of us ran for office, 2 in Charleston, Jim Clyburn, Herbert Fielding, and I, Lady Johnson, myself in Columbia. Now, we didn't seek the office. We were drafted. I mean, we were drafted. Young lawyer, practicing law, I didn't have any money to run a campaign. But Isidore Lurie, Travis Medlock, Alex Sanders, Lem Harper, and they said, we'll help you raise money. And also we will take you into the white community and introduce you to the white community. Almost the same thing happened in Charleston. Joe Riley, who became mayor of Charleston for 40 years. He took Jim Clyburn by the hand and Herbert Fielding, carried them around Charleston County because we were running county-wide. We didn't have single member districts at that time. So that enabled us to penetrate the white community. It enabled us to have money for advertising. And we were successful up to a point. Now we won the June primary. Herbert and Jim in Charleston, I and myself here in Columbia. And come November, we campaigned all summer of 1970. Come election day, November, the 4 of us went to sleep thinking all of us had won. Jim Clyburn woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning and found out instead of him winning by 500 votes, he had lost by 500 votes. But the 3 of us were elected and we went to the State House. They were very cold to us. Some wouldn't even speak to us. It was like we were furniture in the room. That went on for about 2 weeks. And then when they realized that our votes equal their votes, one of them would ease beside your desk. We didn't have offices there. We didn't have the Brown building and the Block building. Your desk was your office in the State House. And they said, Jim, can I get you to sign and co-sponsor this bill with me? And that opened the door. They began to speak to us and we began to interact. The first bill we introduced was to create single member districts. That was 1971. I was put on the committee. Marion Gressett chaired the committee. Marion Gressett, senator from Calhoun County, real racist. And they called his committee the graveyard because anything that the House passed and it got to the Senate he chaired the Judiciary Committee over there, and they made a decision whether or not it'd get out of the Senate or not. He didn't like it. You never heard about it anymore. Well, I got on the redistricting committee, and we ended up with single member districts that took effect in 1974. So we went from 3 of us in 1970 to 13 in 1974 because of single member districts. So that was the beginning. That was for the House side. Now, the Senate was another animal. We didn't get anybody in the Senate until 1985, when Ida Quincy Newman got elected. He became the first Black senator since Reconstruction on the Senate side. He didn't last very long. He died in office, and Kay Patterson replaced Newman on the Senate side. Well, that's kind of how it was. Now, let's go back to the United Citizens Party. While we agree to give this thing another try, Tom Broadwater and the Reverend J.C. McTeer said, we're not going to take a chance. We're going to run on the United Citizens Party. And they did run. Tom Broadwater ran for governor. J.C. McTeer was his running mate. They didn't win, but it stopped people in their tracks and realized that something was happening that we needed to deal with, that we needed to get more involved in this political process, even though the Democrats had opened the door for us to step inside. Well, anyway, that had happened before. In 1944, the Progressive Democratic Party was a party that was formed because Blacks could not participate in the Democratic Party. That's the part. That was before Mr. Elmore's decision in Elmore versus Rice to open up the Democratic primary. 1944. Osceola McCain from Sumter ran for U.S. Senate against Olden D. Johnson. Of course, he did not win. And even the party went to Chicago and challenged the regular Democratic Party, but they were not seated. 20 years later, Fannie Mae Hamer did the same thing in New Jersey at the 64 convention, challenged the Mississippi Democratic Party. So we were kind of on our way in terms of participating in the political process. And with that, I will take questions.
Well, thank you, Jim. Make it clear that when you ran as a Democrat, do you think that the pressure from not only the votes, which scared the hell out of them, but the rise of the United Citizens Party helped open the door for Black candidates like yourself and others? It did. And what happened was, matter of fact, we knocked off 2 incumbents in our race, yes. What is the Democrats? Yes, during the Democratic primary, right? IS and I knocked off 2 incumbents who were there. The Clyburn ran for Secretary. Clyburn ran for Secretary of State. Later on, yes, Clyburn ran for Secretary of State twice. But in 70 he ran for Secretary of State. No, in 70 he ran for the House. In Charleston, he ran for the House. Yeah, there were 11 seats in Charleston, and him and Herbert Fielding picked off 2 of them. And then later on,
he ran for Secretary of State in 78.
Twice.
He ran, yeah. First time he ran was in 1978, and then he ran 4 years later.
That's correct. Whoever said
That's Carol Singletary offering some help there. Okay, so we have a question. I think Randall has his hand raised. Go ahead, please, Randall.
Yes, sir. Why in the world would they pass single member districts knowing that you would jump from 3 to 13 in the next cycle? Over.
The reason we needed some single member districts in order to get more Blacks elected. And that wasn't just at the legislature level, that was at the county council and city council also. County council races, you have to run at large as well. City council race, you have to run at large. And we were never able to get any Blacks. Reynolds v. Sims had a lot to do with that. But yeah. one man, one vote.
Yeah.
Yeah, that goes back to 1960.
So, yeah, that's something that
You're gonna
we've
get to
spoken
that
about
at
in
some
the
point.
past, but it's really important that push for single member districts. Modjeska, John Roy Harper and her had a legal case, I think it was the 80s
Mhm.
for Columbia. And so the single member district didn't just like happen.
No, it took a
had to be
while.
fought.
What,
took a while.
what the single member district, what is that?
Single member districts means that, let's say Columbia is divided, city of Columbia, for example.
Yeah.
This gets to the case you're talking about. In the city of Columbia, you have to run at large. Everybody in the city voted for you, regardless of where they live. Single member districts mean you carve the city up into districts.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what it means, carving an area into districts. So in Columbia now, we have the 421 plan, which was Simkins and John Harper came up with in 1982. That's how we got our first Black elected city council members in Columbia, because of that plan.
Didn't you need white representatives to go along with that bill to pass single member? And why
Yeah.
would they do that?
They did it because of our challenge. If they did not do it, we were going to court on it, and they knew that. Based on on what Brett just said about the two decisions, Reynolds versus Sim and Baker versus Carr. Those were two lawsuits back in the early 60s. That at the federal level, you have to create a single member district. If they didn't go along with it, we were going to go to court and challenge it. And that's what happened with Columbia. We ended up having to go to court because the city fathers would not agree to a plan. And as a result of that, Columbia was divided in 421, four districts, 2 at large, and the mayor's seat. So that's why you have 7 members on Columbia City Council, 4 from districts, 2 at large. That was the best we could do. We would love to have had 6 districts, but that was the best plan we could cobble together. Deal with the Columbia situation.
Jim, let me add a footnote to that single member district fight was so important because what it looks at is this one person, one vote.
Okay.
And that if you're all at large and you've got 35% Black and everybody's voting in the county, the Blacks are not going to get represented because they're going to lose to the majority.
Yeah.
And so that's not balancing it. And so the Reynolds v. Sims case was in 61 when it started and it passed, I think in 64, but it was continuous with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And so we had a growth of Black participation up until 2002, when states like South Carolina, because of gerrymandering, started packing people by race. They call it this partisan gerrymandering,
yes.
but all the Black people happen to be partisan Democrats, and so we're not packing Black people. We're just packing Democrats, and the Supreme Court has ruled that's fine. Partisan gerrymandering is legal, and so now with like for instance, Clyburne's district has been above 60% ever since it was created. In the surrounding congressional districts, they're in the 20s.
Yeah.
So we've got maps that take people out of Clyburne's district and put them over here and make competitive districts where the Black votes are equal to white votes. Right now in South Carolina, the Black votes are equal to 3/5 of the white vote. Some of you may remember that 3/5 number started in 1789 and by the South Carolina delegation to count their enslaved people as citizens.
And speaking of the Clyburne's district, you know, we had hearings in Charleston earlier this year where they want to change that district, NACP and ACLU. We won at the district level, and then 10 days ago, we run at the appellate court level, so it's now going to the Supreme Court on board that Clyburne's district to rechange it again. Other questions?
There's another really interesting question in the chat from Cecil Cahoon. Cecil, go ahead and ask your question. It's a really interesting multi-part question. So go ahead and ask it.
Dr. Felder, I appreciate so much your being here this evening. I divide, when I think about South Carolina's white elected leaders from 1940 to roughly 1980, those who were elected during that period, I divide them into 2 groups. Group A are white supremacists who remained white supremacists throughout and after the civil rights movement, and B, white supremacists who only moderated their white supremacist attitudes after the civil rights movement in order to remain in elective office, because, as you've pointed out, they learned that they needed Black votes as well as white ones. I grouped Thurmond and Gressett and Hollings in that second group. So first, in your opinion, am I wrong to judge the white elected leaders of the state from the 40s to the 80s that way? And second, as you consider the public policies that have been developed in our state during your lifetime, I say during the past 50 years, but really your lifetime, isn't the ideology of that first group still in charge?
Unfortunately, you are correct. I agree with that. As a result of that, we are where we are right now. The state has now become what, red, quote unquote, and that as a result of redistricting. You packing whites over here, packing blacks over there, and because of the numbers, we are 1/3 of the population. But that's not enough to determine a statewide election. Now, the other thing I would like to see us do is to redistrict, do another redistricting, and take some of the Black folk out of a 90% Black district and put over here in a white district. Even though we may not be able to win the election, you could certainly influence it, and you could really be in a position to influence their actions. And that's where we are now.
The first part of my question was, am I wrong to divide white elected leaders in the state from the 40s to the 80s into those two groups? White supremacists who remained white supremacists throughout, and white supremacists who moderated their public positions because they now needed Black votes.
Well, they have moderated their position because they do need Black votes, and that is beginning to happen. Now, what is going to happen in the future with this generation? My grandsons, I've got two of them, one 20 and was there 21, 22, Charlie. I see hope there. These are children who grew up in school together, sleeping over at each other's houses together, going out to parties together. And you don't see the impact of prejudice that was taught to the generation before. So I'm hopeful that I'll be around when I see a difference, and when I see my grandsons in public office with their white buddies. But that's hope. I'm always open to hope.
I have a follow-up to that question.
Yes.
Elder. Let's pick up, Cecil took us to the 80s. We'll take us to the 2020s. I'm seeing, well, I can use Trump as an example. I'm seeing reasonably intelligent people that would bridle at being called racist, voting for candidates that are using race to get elected because it's good for their 401k. And so we now have this economic element that's being driven by people who want to hold on to power by using race. I mean, there used to be, they held on to power by being racist because they were racist. Now they're using race to hold on to power because they're greedy.
Power and
Yeah, I mean, they're racist in doing that, but
You're right on the money. This whole presidential election thing that we're about to go through, it's all about power at this point. Because we can eat in any restaurant if you can afford it, you can live in any hotel if you can afford it, but still, they don't want us in the boardroom. They don't want us at the table. So that's what the problem is. It's power, pure power. And then after this last man who was president and wants to be here again, it's all about power.
Well, on the bright side, Tim Scott declared president today. But no, there are some other interesting questions in the chat as well that are really more about voting rights in the here and now. There's one from Cecil Rigby, I think is really interesting. Do you have an opinion about whether ranked choice voting could be empowering for Black voters and motivate them to increase participation?
Ranked
Choice voting.
That is such a mishigas. It's so screwed up. And they have it in New York,
Mhm.
and they always have a problem with it, because it's a strange way of voting.
We have it in South Carolina because of a bill I wrote that was passed in somewhere in the last 15 years for overseas voters.
Yeah.
And you don't have to have a runoff because in your initial election, let's say there's 4 people running. And oh, I want Jim as number 1, and if
Yes.
he can't win, I want Robert, and and then Coletta. And so where it gets complicated is they count, and then they throw the low one out, they count, they throw the low one out, and somebody wins.
It's
So you actually
confusing.
come up with a more democratic solution, but we're not smart enough to do it.
That's right. That's right. And it takes such a long time.
Yes.
And people
Yeah.
tend to just quit
Mhm.
after a while. Because you gotta go through 1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
So did that answer Mr. Regan's question? I don't know. I think it's a
mess.
good idea, but we're not there yet.
No.
No, actually, I think this is an interesting follow-up that we had, albeit going back to your previous point about James Clyburn.
Mhm.
How do you feel about the recent charge that Jim Clyburn gave away a seat to Nancy Mace in order to keep his own? Again, going back to the question of redistricting in recent years and the current cycle of redistricting in that part of South Carolina.
That's part of the lawsuit I just mentioned.
Yeah.
The fact that they accuse him of giving her part of his district. But that has been changed now. We're waiting for a decision on what's gonna happen with that. At one time his district ran from Columbia to Charleston, over to Myrtle Beach, over to Florence. Geographically, it was the largest district in the state, but at the same time, it was a solid majority district as well. So we'll see what happens with the lawsuit on that.
Hey, before we go back to the chat, are there any questions in the room right now? Any questions at all?
I don't have a question, I have some comments. We're talking about voting rights today. That in that whole series of civil rights legislation, we not only had voting rights, but also there were lawsuits about housing, fair housing, people, opportunities for housing, recreation, jobs, all of that. So what I'm saying is that we've come a long way legislatively, but we still see segregated educational facilities. We still see segregated housing. We still see Black people and minority people making less money in the workplace. And just about everything that took place in the 60s legislatively has been, if not overturned politically, it has been made almost null and void. Now, this didn't just happen. I don't think legislation changes minds and hearts. Okay, so that's, to me, the crux of the matter. It's not South Carolina. I think it's the whole United States of America, which was never intended to be for all people. It's a white country. And that was the premise of the founding of this country. So let's just get to the heart of the matter. Power does not give up its power.
That's right.
All right. And so we're talking about entrenched racism, entrenched racism. From the very beginning, that was the premise of this country, to bring Black people into this country to work and to make money for the white people. It's a white country.
After they wiped
Okay.
out the Native Americans.
So,
I said after they wiped out the Native Americans.
yeah, Native Americans and Asian people. I don't like to use hyphenations. And I'm like,
Americans.
Smokey Robinson, we don't need to be hyphenated. We are Americans. We've been here from the beginning, and we were born here, and all the other people who come here and have been naturalized, or Americans. So we really need to get away from that, unless you're gonna say European Americans as well as Asian Americans, Native Americans, so on and so forth. All right, that's not what I wanted to say, though. In 1969, when I mentioned y'all ran on the UCP party platform and got into the legislature, that was great. And Tom Broadwater, my husband, at that time also ran on that UCP, but for the governor, and my chair for the lieutenant governor. And they were unsuccessful. They were not allowed to be on the ballot. Their name was not on there. So people had to write in, which was another handicap. And so who knows? They may have won. You may have had the first Black governor of South Carolina. Anyway, it was courageous for any of y'all to have done that, to have run. But despite the laws eliminating segregation in housing, our family happened to buy a house in Columbia in a very elitist neighborhood. It was called Wales Gardens up on Saluda Avenue. Only Black people up there. Now, some Black people said, "Oh, we're so proud of y'all. We're so glad to come up here and swim in your swimming pool. You know, this is like a 55 square foot house. So many rooms you didn't know what to name them." I'm serious. So everybody, we had 6 children. Everybody had their own bedroom, their own bathroom. It was that kind of a house. We almost didn't get it because there was a restrictive covenant in the deed, which said this house will never be, this property shall never be alienated, meaning sold, to any person of African descent.
Oh, wow.
That's right. But because it was 1972, they couldn't enforce that law. And so we were able to buy the house. Not to say that it was such a pleasant experience up there, because schools were still not fully integrated or desegregated. And so our children went to the AC Moore, the Hand, those schools that they were zoned to. They did okay. They, children are, they don't know about, they don't become racist. They're not born racist.
Let me get back to your first question.
Okay.
Basic question. The new game in town today is voter suppression.
Yes.
It's no longer a problem of registering to vote and
yes.
running for office,
Right.
but it's voter suppression. And what do I mean? It means that what they're doing now is taking polling places and making it more difficult for people to get to the voting places. They're moving them out the way. They don't want to do the 30-day early voting anymore. That's where the issues are, and it's difficult to do anything about that. You can't go to the court each time because that's something they can do legislatively. The county council, the voter registration office can move a voting precinct without consent. That's where our problem is today in terms of the voting part of it.
Okay.
I understand what you're saying about the housing and all of that, but to get back to voting, that's the new game. Voter suppression, make it as difficult as you can for us to get to the polls and cast our ballot.
Well, when you get to the polls, you have to vote for people who are going to be progressive and who have a heart and who care.
Yes.
Well, we've got actually quite a few questions in the chat, but what I wanted to do is, so Cecil, I see you have a few questions in the chat. I'll come back to yours in a second. Let me get to Hannah Bauer's question first. She wrote, also consider the construction of race was because of capitalism. Aren't they inextricably linked? Doesn't it make sense that economics will be the way racism is coded? And you can both take that question how you want to take it. You can now ask it again.
Yes.
Aren't race and capitalism, aren't they inextricably linked? Doesn't it make sense that economics will be the way racism is coded?
Is coded.
Is coded.
Coded,
Yes.
yes.
The answer is yes.
Yeah.
Yes. No, it's quite clear. I mean, Jim earlier alluded to what Dr. King said. We can go in your restaurant now, but we can't afford the hamburger.
Right.
And economic justice is part of democracy.
It is.
I mean, this is also a key foundational point of the creation of SNCC in the '60s, where
Exactly.
Ella Baker was saying it's bigger than a hamburger.
Mhm.
Like, it's
Yeah.
one thing you can go to the lunch counter and buy a hamburger or get a drink, but it's another question entirely of actually owning the lunch counter, of owning
Yeah.
the production of economic means, et cetera. These are all major questions that I think our school comes back to. And I think tonight's class in particular really shows how folks wanted to approach this in the '60s and '70s.
Let me enhance that a bit, because what the Red Scares, we had one in 1919, another one started after World War II.
Yeah.
And I think they still continue, but they're aimed at protecting money. I mean, it just wasn't really a communist. They accused her of being a communist. She said, I'm not a communist, but if they're doing all those good things you say they are, maybe I should be. But it was for good ideas that they were opposed to, as it happens all the time, that she's going to interfere with business.
Yes.
And so that is a means of the status quo, preserving the status quo, just like rewriting the history books. Preserving the status quo, and the status quo is now run by minions with business administration degrees that will do whatever it is that's best for the bottom line.
Anything else?
Yes. Okay, so Cecil, I'm gonna ask you, so you have 3 questions in the chat. Choose the one you want answered the most first. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask that particular question.
I will. Thank you, Dr. Green. Dr. Felder, again, I'm sorry I'm not there in person. I'd love to have meet you this evening. I have read several times your civil rights in South Carolina and been struck by the many names of educators who participated in various ways in your voter registration campaign in the late 1960s to change the state's voting electorate. Would you talk about the roles and the partnerships that you built with pro-education and progressive educators like Agnes Wilson and Ellen Watson and Joe Grant and others through the 1960s and 70s, and how important were the roles that they played in the work that you did?
They not only played a role, they were a part of it. For example, you mentioned Agnes Hildebrand Wilson, who was my journalism and French teacher at Lincoln High School. She made sure that we were exposed to almost everything. She would take a group to New York Columbia University's Scholastic Press Association each year. We were exposed to the Today Show in 1956. Here I am, a junior in high school, sitting at the Today Show, and we were just happy to be there. And she reached over and pinched me. She said, "Get up and ask a question. You're on national television." I don't remember what I asked, but I'm national television. It was people like her. Also, we had great teachers. They didn't have all the resources that they had in the white schools, but they maximized what they had. They were great role models. You know, back during that time, the Black principal and the Black preacher were the most important people in the community. And you didn't defy them. Black principal could stand at one end of the hallway and just clear his throat. And students would scatter like roaches out of the hall. There's no talking back, no smoking, all of that in the school. And sometimes he wore both hats. He was principal and preacher. Well, those were the kind of people mentored us, and the kind of people that pointed us in the right direction and took a lot of chances with what they were doing. Because in those days, you know, the NAACP was outlawed in South Carolina for a full year, 1956. If you were an employee of the city, county, or state government, you could not be a member of the NAACP. But some of these folk would still pay their dues and say, "Don't write my name down." But they were with you. The Palmetto Education Association, which was the teachers group, they fought very hard and provided money for several of the lawsuits. Yesterday, I spoke to the Congaree Medical, Dental, and Pharmaceutical Association had their meeting yesterday. I spoke to them about how they contributed money for the first lawsuit in South Carolina. So the organization did all they could do with what they had, but we were touched and motivated by that generation. They couldn't do it. We had nothing to lose as students, so we could do it. Like he mentioned Ella Baker. It was Ella Baker who was with Dr. King when he moved from Montgomery, Alabama to Atlanta. She told us, I mean us, I was at Clark College at the time, the first SNCC movement was at her school in Raleigh, North Carolina. Shaw University. And she said, don't be co-opted by the NACP, don't be co-opted by CORE, form your own organization. That's what we did. And of course, the rest is history. Speaking of Sumter again, there's a Lincoln High School graduate named Dora Edith McDonald, South Carolina State graduate. She worked for Dr. King after she finished South Carolina State from the time he came to Atlanta until he was assassinated. She was the one that called Coretta to say, your husband is now dead. People like that we grew up with, we were a part of, and so here we are today. Thank you for reading the book.
All right, I think this is now, I think Brett, you have something to add as well for the last part of our class.
Talk about war.
Wait, is there-
Talk about war.
No, I was waiting.
All right, again, let's give Mr. James Felder a round of applause.
One of the things that I want to set up for the next lesson, we're going to start talking about Vietnam. Vietnam was a real turning point in American foreign policy. Well, where did it turn from? I mean, we look at the age of exploration when adventurous Europeans decided that your land was their land. And I mean, that when we could start with what, the 1400s with the Vikings or the Portuguese in South America. And they were brutal colonists. And all too often, the church worked, and the church would be saving the souls of the people that the explorers were killing.
Yes.
And so we saw that, you know, through the 1700s and the 1800s, and as the United States became civilized, and we had pretty well managed to constrain the native population, the manifest destiny. And there's an essay that was in our study guide 2 years ago that will go out tonight or tomorrow to read before the next class. But it breaks down the steps between the exploration and the manifest destiny was actually an American policy about it is God's plan that we come and help you. We're going to Christianize you so you can take advantage of all these wonderful things that we have. And so the manifest destiny, there's an image that is in the study guide of the eagle spreading its wings 10,000 miles from the Philippines, you know, to Cuba, and all of that was theirs. I mean, you remember the saying about the sun never sets on the British soil, and there was a time when the mother country was trying to colonize this state. It failed. Everybody should remember from our early classes that South Carolina was part of the Carolinas, and the Lord proprietors couldn't get the southern part of the Carolina protectorate to work. And so they jobbed it out to second generation Barbadian slave owners. And so that's why South Carolina had that racist nature of the slave economy bred into the bone, as Modjeska would say. And what's bred in the bone can't be beat out of the flesh, and we still carry that with us. But that that manifest destiny changed into colonialism, and that we have the Philippines was one of our colonies until I think it was 48, when we decided that they'd grown up enough where they could have an economy that we could then control and supported their dictator. So one of the things that we see happening is rather than us going and trying to run the show, we get somebody that will work for us, that's the puppet, that will help take the heat off of us. And as we move, further down the line toward, modernity, we get to the situation where the United States, we have a military presence in over 131 countries today.
Yes, exactly.
And I wouldn't say that we're exactly welcome there, but we do give them a little bit, and protect them from things that we make them afraid of. But in Vietnam, I had the opportunity of living on Parris Island in 64 through 66 and segregated South Carolina and on the integrated military base. That's a different story. But the run up to Vietnam was where I started understanding about the way we were operating overseas with our foreign policy. We were supporting a dictatorship in Taiwan from after Chiang Kai-shek left mainland China. My father was stationed there in 54 as part of the military advisory group, which is the vanguard of American imperialism. The MAG groups were in Vietnam in the 50s, and we were there because we were helping the French maintain their colony. And after World War II, the Vietnamese people who'd never run their own country, I mean, they were vassals of the French for 80 years before the World War II. And before that, it was the Chinese, and the Japanese were in there during World War II. And so when the World War II was over with, and Ho Chi Minh, educated in Paris, had the Viet Minh, or what they call them, were fighting with the American troops against the Japanese. And Ho Chi Minh drafted the Constitution of Vietnam based on our Declaration of Independence. And they thought they had a country for the first time. Wrong. And we decided to support the French recolonization. And that went on for a number of years. And I think Dien Bien Phu was the turning point for the French. And there's a story here that it's very difficult to take democracy at the point of a gun and expect that it's going to last anywhere. I can't cite many places that that's happened. But that the riches of Southeast Asia were what they were after. And they did this magic thing about, well, actually, we're going to have a North and South Vietnam because these Southerners want to be with us. Remember North and South Korea?
Yeah.
And we don't win, but we create this fake compromise and create a fake place and create fake people to support it. And the South Vietnam was clearly not going to last. I mean, those people were fighting for their land, and they were fighting for their homeland. And we lost 52,000 young men. And the thing that really turned the tide there was realizing that the draft wasn't going to work. I mean, it worked, but it also put thousands, millions of people in the streets of America. And so that's where we came up with a volunteer army. So we're back to that point where in the past we would get the mercenaries from the country to be our mercenary army. So we're not showing our hand, but now we created this volunteer army. It's an economic draft. The percentage of Black people in the army now is more than twice, nearly 3 times their general population, because it's an economic draft. But that is now the quote volunteer army that we have that's spread way too thin and not really welcome in many places. The problem that we now is that there was a period where we had all these colonies that contradicted the traditional way that a society would rebel against the manipulation by money. And this is, I'm going to quote a little bit of Marx here about the proletariat is the working people, and then the bourgeoisie is the people with the money. What America did, they were smart enough, they created this mythical thing called the middle class. And so there is no middle class. If you get a paycheck, you're the proletariat, because they take your paycheck away, you got no money. And the people with the money don't work to make their money makes money. And so that's the bourgeoisie. So we created the myth of the middle class on the backs of the third world and the people of color, and that started coming home. And the revolutionary tide that swept the world in the 60s, it was everywhere. It was in South America, it was Central America, it was in Asia, it was in Africa, where people would say, wait a minute, I live here. This is my place, not French, not Portuguese, not American. And so we started losing that third world proletariat. We started and we then came back home to having our Bantustans in Watts and in Harlem and other places where the oppressed people were coming home, coming closer, the chickens coming home to roost, so to speak. And so that coincided in the 1970s with the beginning of globalization. And so globalization was a point where money has no boundary. It's not limited. There's no flag.
Yeah.
And the corporations, as they got bigger and bigger, we've got one of the last classes in the Modjeska schools, one of the most important is about corporations.
Yes.
And if you'll remember in the first class, we talked about the two things the founding fathers taught us that we forgot. One was George Washington warned about parties. He said, don't start parties, you'll end up with two. And Thomas Jefferson said, God forbid we not strangle the moneyed corporations in their infancy. They yet bid defiance against our elected governments. The parties are run by corporations, and the corporations now run the world. The largest corporations in the world don't make anything. And so we'll have Louis Pitts will come down and we'll have this. Well, he's I think going to Zoom this year, but we'll break down the transition of corporations from things they strangled in their infancy. They literally did. In the beginning, corporations had a lifespan, and then they would die, so they don't get too powerful. If you want to build a bridge, you go, okay, you build the Brooklyn Bridge, we're going to give you 10 years to do it, and then you're out of business. And so now we have corporations that actually have more rights than people. We just had Vernon Burton and Armin Durfner speaking about their recent book, Justice Deferred, which we have copies of that you can purchase, and the Progressive Network gets to keep the money. But Justice Deferred is about how the Supreme Court, Armin Durfner has practiced more in the Supreme Court than probably anybody that ever lived in South Carolina. And Vernon and Armin wrote this book about how the Supreme Court rulings predicated on the 14th Amendment, that was the 14th Amendment's intention was to make people of color citizens. But the rulings of the Supreme Court have favored corporations as opposed to people. And so this is, as my friend Ms. Broadwater was pointing out, it's bred in the bone. That the laws are supporting this, the mores are supporting this, the cultures are supporting this, and it is a very, very large ship that's very difficult to turn the rudder of.
Yeah.
But more and more, it's not working. And the dissolution of the status quo is seen by this insane person that was the last person that was president before this person is president, and that people are clinging to that for just a little bit of safety and money, and they're afraid to go somewhere. And so I think that that's part of what we're trying to do, is to create an understanding of the common values that we have, regardless of what party we are, what color we are. We have common values, and we need to organize around those. And we have to kind of like circle the wagons for the storm, because it's going to get worse before it gets better.
Yes.
That this business of the chickens coming home to roost is something that is going to be really wearing on the economy. I didn't know what gig economy meant for a long time, and I figured it out. It's like the absence of a career, and the young people today just go from one gig to the next. And I would think that they wouldn't like that, but they had a proposition statewide in California recently where all of these groups like Uber and the people driving cars to feed people and those things, they put the ballot on the ballot that they would be employees instead of contract employees. If you're a contract employee, you have to pay your own taxes, you don't have any benefits, et cetera. And it was over. It didn't pass because the young people wanted not to be tied down. And so we have fewer people owning their own homes now, and fewer people with jobs, and fewer people making enough money to put into Social Security. And so the middle class is a really endangered species that's going to make people a lot meaner and a lot harder to deal with. And we're going to have a whole lot better sales pitch than we've had in a long time with the Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party doesn't have a very good track record in leading us to the promised land, because they're feeding at the same trough. If you look at the major conventions, you'll see the signs of their sponsors, just like in a sporting event.
Mhm.
And I think the money forces, I really thought and still hope that they will keep the insane people from driving the whole thing over the cliff, because smart people don't kill the goose. Smart people don't kill the goose. And that makes me think of the people that have been running South Carolina aren't very smart people. They actually had a campaign called the Golden Goose Campaign. And they were advertising how this was in the late 70s. The Chamber of Commerce had a campaign called the Golden Goose. And they had these different images, and one of them was of a worker with a hard hat on, in profile, grinning with a daisy in his mouth, with a dirty t-shirt on, white beater t-shirt, with his belly sticking out. He looked like he was pregnant. This grinning guy with a hard hat on, looking like he's pregnant, and the caption was, I saw this in LaGuardia, and where you get off the airplane. The caption was, South Carolina has no labor pains. And advertised that we have the least number of work hours lost due to labor disputes of any state. Basically, our people work cheap and they're stupid. Y'all come on down. Our environmental laws are really lax. And so this is what the people that have been running the show for an awful long time were willing to do to make money. And we're running out of options to be able to exploit people. And so it's coming home to roost.
Yeah.
So I want to prep everybody to read Becky's book before the next class. We've got copies here for people that are in the class, and if you're not in the class, we'll give you one and you can make a small donation. The oh, I did. One of the things that went out in the study guide was an example of really egregious American policy. And it's an example that I lifted up because it's familiar. I'm involved. Lee Atwater's involved. Paul Manafort's involved. Roger Stone's involved. And ETV's involved. And I got a phone call. I think it was about 84. Reagan was in office. Atwater had moved to work with Manafort, Black and Stone. And remember, Manafort, Black and Stone was the torturers lobby. And they were defending Marcos, and I can't even remember all the names of the dictators they were defending, but one of them was named Joseph Savimbi. And Joseph Savimbi was a mercenary that was helping the Portuguese retain Angola under the guise that he was a liberation fighter. But he was really taking money from the Portuguese, he was taking money from the oil companies, he was taking money from South Africa to keep the socialist group under wraps. And I remember talking to Simkins about this, and that was amazing. I could be all excited to go tell her something I thought I knew, and she knew the tribes that were involved and the people that were involved in people. But that in Angola, and one of the reasons we were aware of it and close to it was that the Cubans were helping the Angolans defend the ground that the MPLA, it was the People's Army that was actually fighting to nationalize the oil as opposed to letting the oil companies take the wealth from the country. So that's what it was about. That's what it was about. It was about who owns the resources of their country. And the United States was on the wrong side.
As usual.
And what got my attention was when I got a call alerting me to a film that had been put up on the ETV satellite. And at the time, Henry Cawthon was directing, the founder and the director of educational television. And I was a person of the very few in South Carolina that knew that South Carolina educational television is the only ETV system in America that's completely owned by the public, by us, the taxpayer. It's completely controlled by the legislature. And when you lift the lid on that and find out that happened in '59, you read about the legislature wanting to close the schools instead of integrate them. And so they said, well, we can start a statewide TV station and keep the little kids at home and they don't have to mix races. So that legislative control of ETV is unique. And so ETV was contracted to put this film up on the satellite that would go worldwide. And there was a speaker from ETV, one of their directors, at the beginning of the film, with the state seal behind him, with ETV's imprimatur on it, referring to Joseph Savimbi as the George Washington of Angola. I have yet to get to the bottom of this and trying to get things from them. I took the film, I had the film with that on it, and I made arrangements through other parties and went and met the mission, they call the Charge d'Affaires of the People's Army at the United Nations and gave them the film. But this was brought to you by the Torturers Lobby, Atwater, Manafort, and Stone, and ETV. And so this is a small world, isn't it? But what that is that story isn't necessarily significant about Savimbi or Angola. I could talk about Iraq. I could talk about Iran. I mean, when the CIA overthrew Mossadegh in I think it was 54, and Iran, he was a socialist. He was elected by the people. They had a very enlightened middle class growing society. We smashed it and put the Shah in, and he was brutal for many years. And then the revolution came, and those people remembered who did that. I wonder why they don't like us. Or we could talk about Chile. We could talk about any number of countries. But you'll get in trouble if you do. I was raised well. I only tried to do what I was raised to believe in, and they kept beating me up and putting me in jail. But we need more of us to be able to speak truth to power and support the effort to build a community of shared values. And so that's all I've got to say this evening, Dr. Crane.
No.
But I exercise.
I do want to end class on this note. Of course, we do not have a class next Monday because next Monday is Memorial Day. So you do want to take some time to really reflect on some of the things we've learned in class. And in particular, I want to end class with this particular image because I think it actually ties everything we've discussed this evening. This is actually the cover of the first issue of Southern Exposure magazine, which was produced by and for progressive Southerners in the 1970s and 80s. And it says here, Southern Exposure, the military, and the South. Wow. And the first article, first essay you see in this magazine was written by Julian Bond and Leah Wise. It's called Violence and Genocide, the American Way of Growth and Expansion. Now, I mention this because I think it's a good way to really sum up what we've been talking about this evening in terms of both American foreign and domestic policy. But it's also a good way for us to think about what we'll be talking about 2 weeks from now on June 6th, when we start really getting into what social movements are looking like in South Carolina, especially with both Monroe in the 1970s and 80s, and then after that, the creation of the Progressive Network in 1996. As you can tell this evening, hearing from myself, Mr. Felder, and Brett, we have a lot of work to do on every single front you can imagine. The good news is that I think all of us here in this class are dedicated and determined to get that work done. Yeah. All right, so have a good rest of your Monday and good rest of your week. Remember, there's no class next week. Have a safe Memorial Day weekend, and we'll see you.
Becky's book. For those who don't have it.
And there is a link in the chat to purchase Becky's book, Generation Now. So, no. So please make sure to check that out if you haven't already, and make sure you check out the readings online as well for the class coming up pretty soon.
Is there
Dr. Green?
something?
Dr. Green?
No. Yes, go ahead.
Will there be a deep dive on the Sunday before Memorial Day?
No,
Just ask your question.
no, there's no deep dive this coming Sunday.
No,
Thank you.
I'm not class Monday.
Have a good night.
Good night.
Have a good
Night.
one. Till
Let me
then,
just say,
safe.
y'all don't need to buy the book. It's coming to you. So please don't buy the book.
Becky,
Okay.
leave me
Oh, thank
alone.
you.
Marjorie,
Becky,
Get over
leave
it.
me alone.
Or at the
Thank you,
very least,
Cecil
make
Calhoun.
a
The other part.
So are you, Randall. I appreciate that.
One that.
Excellent question, Cecil Cahoon. Excellent question.
If Dr. Felder is hanging around, I'd love to hear him talk about a couple of smaller questions that I had. Did we lose the room? I think we lost.
No, I wanted to hear the answers to the questions you asked.
I
The
can tell you
29th
from
birthday question.
Yeah, I can tell you from reading his book that the question having to do with his purposeful tardiness at the during his session was because at the front of the House and at the front of the Senate, those chambers still flew the Confederate flags. And at the beginning of each day's chambers session, they would pledge allegiance to the flags in the front. And so Dr. Felder and Eileen V. Johnson and Herbert Fielding would wait outside the chamber until after the pledge had been given before coming in, and they did that purposefully as a protest against the Confederate flag hanging in the front. And then by sheer coincidence, Dr. Felder's 29th birthday happened to be the night that MLK was assassinated, April 4, 1968. So I have not read his reflections on that night and how he learned. So I was curious about what happened that evening. That was his 29th. When you take into account if you read his books, what he did between the ages of 20 and 30, or what he was a party to, what he was involved in, it's truly amazing. He was the leader of the honor guard that buried John Kennedy, that buried President Kennedy. He was the leader of the honor guard. He was in the military at the time. In 1960, let me go back. In 1960, when he was 21 years old, he met MLK at MLK's home in Atlanta. They had a long conversation with others about what could and should be done over the years to come. 2 years later, he's the leader of the honor guard that buries Kennedy. The next year, he went to Howard Law School, was there for 3 years. In 67, he mentioned Vernon Jordan recruited him to come back to South Carolina. He was from Sumter originally, to come back to run the voter registration campaign for the next 2 years. In January of 68, he was in the state working on the voter registration campaign when Wadey's Waring died in New York City. And Wadey's Waring's body was brought back to Charleston to be buried. And Dr. Felder was there. He says, not many white people were there, but hundreds of Black South Carolinians turned out at the funeral in Charleston. I would love to hear him talk about that. And then of course, in just 3 months later, that was in January of 68. Then 3 months later, he turned 29 and MLK was killed. And then in 70, he ran, and he talked about on the night that he ran, Jim Clyburn thought he went to bed thinking that he had won the 4th House seat that they competed for that year, and woke up, was awakened to learn he did not. So he was a party to or led more in his 20s than many other people do or are a party to in 2 or 3 or more decades. Just an amazing person. And that he's still here and still lucid and still able to reflect and describe those experiences as a marvel to me.
And I have lived through these events. I basically flunked out of Johns Hopkins University because they closed the campus in 70 because of the protests. And I had something like 42 credits to get done by the spring and I couldn't do it. And I didn't know enough, since I was the first person in my family to go to college. I had an emotional breakdown, and I applied for conscientious status. But all of these things, I came to South Carolina thinking it was backwards. And as a history major, I've seen more revolutionary and Civil War history,
right?
World War II history, and as far as the civil rights, I mean, I was in amongst it in Baltimore. But this course is amazing. It blows me away every week.
I agree. This is why I keep coming back year after year, Randall.
I understand now.
I love this.
Yeah. Well, and I'm sorry, I don't want to put you on the spot or anything, but I look to you for sort of context and leadership because of your background in unionism and in liberal progressive politics. I don't want to put that on you. That's just between you and me and and who Keith
And Becky and Stephen and Keith and Trevor and Annette.
Stephen and Becky.
Right.
But and Keith, we got on the first open house. So it's good that you're still hanging around. But Cecil, I think you're pretty amazing.
I appreciate that. I
Thank
brought
you.
unionism with me, but I'm a student of South Carolina history, just like you.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
When I was in Florida, I became a student of Florida history, and Florida history was taught in 4th, 8th, and 11th grades. And I had a publishing company in the 80s and early 90s that was purely based on Florida history, geography, environmental education, and whatever the fourth one was. And then we woke up one morning and the Florida legislature had changed the curriculum to distribute Florida history to all 12 grades, and we were suddenly basically out of business.
Oh, I see.
But I think I can contribute a lot as far as creating vehicles that can be passed to other people to get the message out. And that's what I'm Becky, I see you're on. And I'd love to be able to contribute something to that. Having had experience, I was the go-to person for educational tourism in Florida, and we've got the same basic potential here. So I don't want to hold anybody any longer, but I'm just in love with this course and the great folks that are in it. And Cecil, thank you so much. Keith, Stephen, Becky, and all of the people who have.
Yep. If I could put a bug in your ear, Randall, if I could put a bug in your ear, the way that I show my love for this is I'm an ambassador for this course. I go and beg my colleagues who are educators in South Carolina to go to pronet, scpronet.com, find out, how to register and have pushed and pushed and pushed. And unfortunately, too few have taken me up on this. I think only 3 or 4 in the last 3 years, have taken me up on this. I wish that many, many more would, because the more educators who don't know these things get involved and learn these things, then the more this kind of awareness can spread. I would encourage you to reach out to your networks for the same reason.
If my experience, and I was very successful until the legislature bombed me out, was that if you can put stuff in teachers' hands that is labor saving for teachers.
Exactly right.
And
Do
effective.
Do it for
them. Because I've got a master's in instructional design, and I can put together effective materials. And I see so much here. Becky and I need to talk about putting together a set of posters like you see in the Grow building. Brett and I remember in our college days, there was a whole set of Russian revolutionary posters you could buy and put on your dorm walls back in the late 60s. And that would, kids, I have an 18-year-old just got done his first year at Clemson. He brought home a bunch of stuff he had on his walls. They still do that. That's messaging. So anyway, I'm honored to have this little chat with you.
Thank you,
Because
Ryan.
it's great.
Thank you.
And thank you
Randall,
all.
I gotta say, you're gonna have to get in line. I'm Cecil's biggest fan. You're gonna be second favorite fan. Because I
Hey,
work
wait a
with this
minute.
man and I know, I know what
Steven.
he is. He is a wealth of resource of history. I mean, you name it and he knows it. And so I would like invite all of y'all that are still hanging in here after the class started that you're really interested in this. And I hope that you will, once we've graduated, the graduation is July 3rd. We'll let you celebrate on July 4th. And let's reconvene like that same week or soon thereafter and like talk about how we can repackage pieces of this so it's, Cecil, and we've been talking about this, but let's broaden this out to people that want to see this happen, to make these things not a 4-month commitment for people, but like make it bite-sized for different constituencies, different audiences. And let's make it happen, because this really is gold that is happening here. And the sad thing is that not enough people are seeing it. So whatever you can do, Randall, to make that happen, I know you've got all kind of resources and skills. Cecil, goes without saying. You too, Keith and Stephen, you can help us online. I mean, we can do this, y'all. Let's do it. Okay.
Just,
and I love you.
Just to promote myself.
Thanks
for
you all.
15 seconds.
Thank you all.
Go ahead, Randall. Are we
Just
going?
to promote myself for 15 seconds.
Yeah.
I was first published internationally when I was 23 years old. I have won national awards for my instructional designs. I am a superb writer of simplified English, and I don't want to quit. I am Brett's age, and I've got these skills that I want to be able. And this is, for me, this has been life-changing. That's all I'll say.
Wow. Good.
Amen.
Well, thanks to all of you. Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Keith.
Thank y'all. It's
Well,
really
keep in touch, please. And I just love you guys to death.
Oh, back
Thank
at
you.
you.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.